All right. So last time we got cut off a little unexpectedly, although I should have expected it because I knew I had a meeting at 2 o'clock and I lost track of time. But I believe we ended on a note that you brought up about the Grand Inquisitor. Um, Part of the deal that he was offering people for staying, what would you say, subordinate to the church is some leeway in terms of sin. So if you wanted to elaborate on that, and then we'll just see where we go.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm trying to reconnect this thinking alongside the way that this chapter ends is like this sort of relationship between like foregoing responsibility for creation, a sort of quantity of scale over those who hold truth or power, and then the attempt to either live up to those expectations or kind of fall flat before them.
Right.
And, I think what's sort of the crux of this being discussed before the pinnacle of the conversation between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor is like no, we stretched your bargain as far as we could. Mm-hmm. And he's sort of like, and I did a better job than you did, because like, you can talk all about this kind of like cosmic whimsy, but like we're on the ground, like we're baking bread,
We're front lines.
Yeah, totally. We're treating lepers, like we've kind of produced a sort of like a suburban cul-de-sac version of forgiveness, mm-hmm. right? Where like you mess up because you're gonna, because you're made that way, mm-hmm. and we give you a way back in, mm-hmm. And yeah, that's sort of being like an argument to against because all Christ really has to say, or like if he were, what I suspect he would say in response to this is kind of like it makes me think of, there's a quote from As I Lay Dying, William Faulkner, and the line is just like, I feel like a wet seed in the hot blind earth. Okay. And what he's talking about basically, I think, is this notion of how zero turns into one, mm-hmm. right? Like creation itself, the labor of that is, the miracle that kind of like Christ has on his resume. Right. And, the Grand Inquisitor is sort of like, yeah, good, great. Like,
so it's an efficacy argument, if I'm hearing correctly. The Grand Inquisitor is saying,
yeah,
like we might, if we agree on the problem, right? So we might want to specify what the problem is. The problem, let's say it's the original problem, the problem of eating the apple and knowing that there is good and evil in the world, and that you are capable of committing it yourself, and that it is capable of being inflicted on you, and that you will suffer and die, and that knowing that removes you from a state of ignorant bliss. And he's sort of saying, well, okay, Christ, your way of dealing with that is not as effective as my way. Is that sort of what you're saying to some
extent? That's one component of it too, and I think I would go further to say that, if you imbue Ivan in that conversation too, he's like, not only am I saying that it's inefficient, it's ineffective, like it's morally unjust,
right? And I think what you see here is, to the extent that the Grand Inquisitor is an avatar of Ivan himself, which I think that is inarguable to some extent, right? The Grand Inquisitor is mouthing the argument Ivan would mouth to Christ if he could talk to him, right?
Even more so, I think he's aligning with Alyosha too, because he's like, if I were to join you in the cloth in my way, you know, he's sort of like, if I were in the same business as you, this
Yeah.
is where I'd be, you know.
Okay. Okay. So, what is the problem? So, and here's why I'm bringing this up. I think the reason Ivan suffers, to go back to rebellion, there's a reason these two chapters are put together. What Ivan's talking about in rebellion is the eternal problem of eating the apple, right? All of the how can you justify existence if it necessitates the innocent suffering needlessly, right? It's the knowledge of that, of evil to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
that is making him psychologically suffer and rebel, as Alyosha says, right? So I don't think it's a stretch to say that the rebellion is that Ivan's partaking in is similar to uh, the Milton Paradise Lost-esque rebellion of Satan as a fallen angel who rejected God's plan for being faulty to some extent
Mm-hmm.
and thinks I could do it better. I think Dostoevsky is trying to set up this dichotomy. There's an intellect and there's an arrogance to it, but it's not incorrect. And then there's the Christ element, something godly and good, but beyond reason. And what's interesting is Ivan conceptualizes both of them, right? Because Ivan's telling the story. So Ivan's envisioning how Christ would react to the Inquisitor. And he knows that there's something heartwarming about it because remember, the Inquisitor let Christ go after the smooch, as he put it before, right? So what is the remedy? There's two options here. What is the remedy to the apple being eaten? What do you do if you can't reason your way through to an acceptance of the metaphysical substrate, as you put it, the foundation upon which all things are built, without leaving out facts, right? Ignoring certain things. Ivan refuses to do that. Or concocting some sort of rationalization. You don't want to explain it away. But how do you actually come to terms with it in a way that you're not compromising your conscience? Ivan seems to be refusing to do that. And I think the move Dostoevsky makes is in Alyosha kissing Ivan back at the end. Now, why do I think that that is the response that wins the argument? It doesn't prove Ivan incorrect. I think it's more like, I think Christ is doing the same thing to the Inquisitor. It's like, all that's very nice, but we still must love each other, or something like that. Like it's, since I'm making this for my AP class, I'll bring this up. It reminds me so much of Candide, at the end of Candide, when this character Pangloss, who runs his mouth trying to figure out through metaphysical philosophy what the world is, and then he comes up with a theory and tries to rationalize everything to fit his theory, whatever. At the end of the novella, Candide, who has been going through this process himself of trying to figure out how do you make sense of all this, his response to the last question Pangloss asked him is, it's like, that's great, man, but let us cultivate our garden. That's all we can do. We can't answer the question. We can't make sense of it. But we can do what we can in our own sphere of influence, in our garden, to answer the question of what do you do about being kicked out of the original garden? The answer must be work on your garden to approximate the original garden, because you can't go back. Ivan seems like he's yearning through a way to go back, even if it means being forced to do so through submission back into ignorance. And it seems like the Christ figure and Alyosha, because he wants to suffer too. It's like, no, the answer isn't a return to, it isn't an unknowing or an uneating of the apple. It's not an unknowing of evil. So it's not a matter of letting the children play and not holding them accountable, as the Grand Inquisitor wants to do, sort of. Wants to turn everybody into children. It's you keep going and you look the evil in the eye and you kiss it. Now, I'm gonna end there for a second. I'm gonna throw it to you because I feel like I'm dominating. I'm talking too much. You know what I mean? I don't want to dominate the time. Any thoughts or anything? Or we could shift gears if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you begin to cycle on this, not you, as we begin to cycle on this, you sort of begin to see this like rationale gets centered and centered and centered and centered more as you begin to like hone in on this equation that can't be zeroed out, right? That can't be just like justified. That there's always this remainder of requiring, seeking more, and to me, it exaggerates the notion that this is a privileged position where you're like, why can't we perfect this? Like, why can't we just make this heavenly? And it ignores this massive truth that's just like, you know, endlessly beneath you, that there's always a hell, you know, in this like seeking heaven constantly and looking into the tiny cracks, you know, and focusing on the inability to justify being itself with perfection, is the ignorance that there's always a hell beneath you in the same way. You know, there's always this notion of like, you know, bottomless grief and ceilingless joy, you know. And if you're constantly justifying that like we can't collectively reach this ceiling, you know, that like or, you know, expanding on this math, right? Like he uses the example of that none of this is worth it, even for the suffering of one innocent, right? And that math compounded across all time, right, is like an insane bargain to try to reckon with.
Right.
I mean that with those words chosen specifically. Like if you bear down on that notion, you know, of others suffering, or even to take this further, that like if you consider some, you know, Eastern notions that like that we're connected in some way and that the suffering belongs to all of us, you know, to try to justify being in the face of that makes the bargain even harder.
Right.
So I think this is where this sort of like all of these cracks begin to appear, and that's where like he attempts to filter like love in, right, as sort of this like you know, like cement that fills in these open wounds that are just kind of like forming in myriad patterns in this argument.
It's tough. Sorry, it's so tough because as soon as you bring up the word love,
yeah,
you can you can almost feel like half of potential people who would watch this, just their eyes rolling. Because
Oh, my eyes are rolling as I say it.
where do you get? But like, I know exactly what you mean, but it's the hardest thing to articulate.
That's
Right?
why he places it there.
I know.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to do. I think this is the place to do something I mentioned to you earlier. I'm going to bring up two quotes
Mm-hmm.
um, from The Idiot, another Dostoevsky novel. Um, there's a character named Ippolit, I don't know how to pronounce it, who is he's very much in tune with Ivan, right? Like in the sense, I'll continue this metaphor, in the sense that they feel like they're out of tune with existence to some extent. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
not resonating. There's no harmony there, but they're seeking a harmony um, that's lacking. Um, and it's almost like they want to go to some sort of open tuning that has no dissonance whatsoever, no possibility for dissonance. Does that make sense? Like
Oh, yeah.
every note you play is the right note.
Yeah, everything's in phase.
It's so limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there needs to be a little element of sadness and melancholy for something to be beautiful, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't want any of that to some extent. But anyway, the reason the first one I think will set the stage for for a contextual understanding of how Ivan fits into Dostoevsky's thinking as a whole, right? So let me just read this to you. Looking at such a picture. Now, I should give you some context. Ben, I sent you that picture of a dead Christ sort of decomposing by Hans Holbein. Holbein? I don't know how to say it. Which, if you want to look up, please do. If I had been more prepared, I would have had a picture to put on the screen right now, but I'm not that prepared. Maybe Benji, if you want to look it up.
I was gonna see. I can add it to the chat. I don't know if that adds to the.
Okay.
I'll put it in.
Okay. Let's see if I can.
Oh, we can probably screen share here. Hold on a sec.
Yeah, we can do that.
Such an old person.
I know. Sorry, folks. It will make more sense with the picture. But anyway, so they're discussing this picture, which is something Dostoevsky actually traveled to go see in his life. It's just a picture of Christ in a tomb, I think the day after his crucifixion, and the body is starting to decay. You can almost see like rigor mortis set in, like parts of him are blue. It's very different than the more idealized images that you would see of a crucifixion scene. So let me just read this regardless of the picture. Looking at such a picture, one conceives of nature in the shape of an immense, merciless, dumb beast, or more correctly, much more correctly speaking, though it sounds strange, in the form of a huge machine of the most modern construction, which, dull and insensible, has aimlessly clutched, crushed, and swallowed up a great priceless being. This picture expresses and unconsciously suggests to one the conception of such a dark, insolent, unreasoning, and eternal power to which everything is in subjection. So the reason I brought that up is it seems like he's talking about a sort of entropy of innocence, like the way the universe is constructed. And the reason I'm bringing this up is this connects to Ivan. There's the picture. There you go. You see here pictured in innocent, and the world conspired like a dumb machine that doesn't know what it's doing to crush this innocence and wipe it off of the face of the globe. And so what is that? Well, it's the story of man, that innocence fades, childhood fades. It happened to us as a species, apparently, and it happens to each one of us as individuals as we mature and lose our innocence. But there's a part of Dostoevsky that really emphasizes why that's significant. almost to say that this is the way the game is structured, that there's these little blossoms of innocence, and then entropy causes them to decay, or the world attacks them and causes them to decay. And the knowledge of that is the knowledge of good and evil, which is the eating of the apple. So it's very meta in a way. Knowledge of the fact that we've lost innocence and know good and evil is itself the eating of the apple, the knowledge of good and evil. So Ben, if you want to come back, we could probably take that off the screen. There's another passage I want to read to you, because I think this is Christ being able to kiss the Inquisitor. But the Christ in the Grand Inquisitor story doesn't say anything. So it's very hard for us to know if he's like naively loving. Does that make sense? Like he could just be like a Winnie the Pooh, right? And no matter how evil you were to him, he'd just be like, "Oh, I love you anyway." But it's not that. And let me read this to you. So now he's describing, I forget which character is saying this right here. He's describing a fake painting. If he could paint a picture of Christ, right? You get the sense Dostoevsky is saying this. What would it be? So he describes what that painting would be. Yesterday, after meeting you, I went home and invented a picture. Artists always paint Christ as he appears in the gospel stories. I would paint him differently. I would imagine him alone. His disciples must have left him alone sometimes. I would leave him only a little child beside him. The child would be playing beside him, perhaps be telling him something in his childish words. Christ has been listening, but now he is thoughtful. His hand still resting unconsciously on the child's fair little head, he is looking into the distance at the horizon. Thought, great as the whole world, dwells in his eyes. His face is sorrowful. The child leans silent with his elbow on Christ's knees, his cheek on his little hand, and his head turned upwards, and looks intently at him, pondering as little children sometimes ponder. The sun is setting. That is my picture. You are innocent, and in your innocence lies all your perfection. And then it goes on and on and on. And I remember what I wrote, what I annotated here. I just wrote, Salinger would love this. That's what I wrote, honestly. Because what that means to me is that Dostoevsky's conception of Christ, and we should get this out of the way. We're not talking about this as Christians. We're talking about this as people analyzing Dostoevsky's conception of an ideal, right? And I think that's what Christ is to him. He makes that clear a bunch of times. But his ideal is a figure who stands with the child. The child is sort of playing and discussing things with the Christ figure ideal. But the Christ figure looks out into the horizon, sort of to the future, full of thought and sorrow, knowing what will happen to the child. Right? Now, what is this ideal? This is the ideal of someone who carries the whole burden that Ivan carries all the time. What was in that conception of the Christ ideal figure is what's on Ivan's mind.
Right.
But even with that, he kisses the Inquisitor, to go back to the Grand Inquisitor. So what is going on there?
I have a thought,
Okay.
if I may, which I think he's kind of casting a line into the field of what omnipotence is, right? Because I think he's talking a lot about like this sort of tradition of doubt within a religious or spiritual pursuit, and I think he also doesn't want to get into it so explicitly because it's kind of a jumping off point to just produce polarity, to either be, you know, I think he's trying to basically contend, even, you know, it produces kind of a natural thought experiment for me that, I mean, much in the way a parent brings a child into the world, there's it's not a perfect conception.
Oh,
You know, it's not full, like when one doesn't have a complete and granted we're mortals, but I'm using this for an example. You know, we don't have a complete conception of what fate is going to befall our children.
yeah.
We do know that our children are going to die someday,
Yes.
right?
We can be certain of that.
That's a big enough bargain,
Yeah.
uh, challenging enough bargain to go. Is it, do I have the right to do this?
Yeah. And it's
You
built
know,
into every, ooh, you just
right?
microcosm, macrocosm.
Exactly.
You see what you've done? Ooh.
Yes.
Very
But
well
I
put.
think that's kind of what he's contending here too, in a way of how one conceives a creator in their mind. You know, that there, this notion that there's flawed mortality and perfect, um, you know, omnipotence is a bit of is maybe rife with a little bit of scaling issue.
Right.
Um, that's what I see him kind of challenging in this, with this kiss. And you know, when I brought up the idea of love, I don't necessarily mean it in the in sort of only shallow ways. I do mean it in some shallow ways, but I also mean it in um, the notion of like right, or something like this, or God loving you.
Yeah.
Um, it comes back to kind of the theme of the three themes he offered us. Like mystery
Mhm.
is sort of the one that like comes right back in,
Yeah.
um, because to not see that as a sort of mysterious component of this bargain, I think would be an error.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that. So I think you're right about that. And I also think, um, I feel like,
Oh, you're back now. I lost you for a
yeah, I
second.
lost you for a second too. I was sort of waiting. I feel like it's almost like Christ's response, which Dostoevsky would probably say is the right response, though the Grand Inquisitor is also correct and Ivan is still correct, right? I think that's the needle that he has to thread.
Yeah.
Um, very narrow path to take is that yes, it is every every form of innocence that exists, every spring blossom, every child is doomed, whether by the Turk with the gun in the moment or
Mm-hmm.
by time and old age, to become corrupted and suffer and die. Right? Um, it's just it's made very poignant by the fact that it happens instantly with the Turk shooting the baby who was
Right.
laughing, not understanding what was happening. But and that's just a matter of scale. You zoom out or you fast forward, however way you want to look at it, that happens to everybody regardless. So that entropy is there. And I think what Dostoevsky might be trying to propose is that the Christ ideal is like an anti entropic. Is that even how you would say that?
Mm-hmm.
The anti entropic force, in the sense that it's the force by yielding that we talked about last time, like a Taoist Eastern sense. Um, and kissing the Inquisitor, he doesn't add to the tension and conflict that speeds up the entropy process.
Right.
But instead, it's that force yearning to climb to the top of the mountain, pursuing the heights. Whereas the Grand Inquisitor, in an ironic twist of fate, thinking that he's doing the right thing to tweak a flawed existence, is planning to murder innocence itself, which was the exact problem that he was attempting to avoid, right? And killing the Christ figure again. And that's the twist. But it's impossible to live up to. And this is why I love Alyosha plagiarizing the Christ figure and kissing Ivan back in the same sort of way. It's funny, I'll get to this in this sort of backwards way, backdoor way. So we're talking today on the Monday after Easter, right? Yesterday, for some reason, I was doing some research. I looked up the harrowing of hell, because my wife and I were talking about, well, what was Christ supposedly doing that Saturday? You know, he during the time when his body is in the painting, right? As the story goes in the Christian tradition, he died on Good Friday. Saturday, what did he do? Sunday, he rose, right? Like, what was that question mark? I don't know, right? Like, how do they explain that in the tradition? So apparently there's something called the harrowing of hell, which Christ went down to the underworld and unlocked the gates for the souls of the people sort of in limbo down there to come out. But specifically, all that I don't really care about, doesn't really interest me. The part that did interest me was that supposedly there's a focus on, after he dies, he rescues Adam and Eve from the underworld, as if he is the remedy to the fall, right? He's the way out of the predicament Ivan, the thought predicament Ivan has boxed himself into. So the reason I bring that up is because, of course, Alyosha kisses Ivan. And I think in doing so, Dostoevsky's trying to resolve the problem Ivan and the Grand Inquisitor had with Christ, was that he left people with nothing to do, no specific, what do you say? Well, we only have you as a personality to imitate, or something like that. Nothing else. We're sort of on our own except for that. And that was too much to ask. So what Dostoevsky does is take it a step back. And he says, no, well, no matter what, in any situation, Ivan, you conceive of what the Christ figure, or Dostoevsky's personal ideal, or what can you say, the personification of goodness itself, or something like the Platonic form of good, if that were a person, you know in your conscience, because Ivan knew in his story of the Grand Inquisitor what that figure would do. If you can pinpoint an exact scenario, you can think it through to that level. And by having Alyosha kiss Ivan, it's sort of saying, that's what you should aim for. Aim to be the person, imitate the person who imitates the person who is the imitation of God or goodness itself. And that's something maybe you could do. That's more realistic. And that maybe if you do it enough, you can make it a habit. And then you're more the anti-entropy force than the force dragging everybody down with your nihilism. Does that make sense at all?
Yes, it does. I think this is where we don't deviate that much at the end of this, but I do think it's worth representing some of where I think we Well, I may be projecting a little bit in that when you introduced this to me, you were kind of like, Alyosha wins this argument without saying anything. Here's why.
Yeah.
And I think that was
Can I clarify
a
real quick?
really approach.
I think he Dostoevsky thinks Alyosha is right, even though Ivan is correct.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Though I think what actually, for me, what happens here, and again, I'm going to come back to my thematic contribution to this discussion, productive or not, though it may be, is this notion of substrate.
Yeah.
And what's revealed for me in this part of the conversation is substrate. It's the bottom rung of the ladder. You know, it's the first sign of a shoreline that something can be built on. This is sort of a thought experiment.
Yeah.
And Ivan reveals this when, after he's kissed, he's basically, I'm paraphrasing now, but he says, like, I'll do this for you, Alyosha, you know, like I do it for you. And it's kind of an offhanded comment, like, you know, but what he reveals is like all of this framework is effectively built on the innocence of Alyosha, right? Like without that, where there's only nihilism, right?
Right.
Or there's nothing at all. And I think Alyosha also is revealing his substrate in this example, which is Christ, and which is what you basically just demonstrated, which is like the fundamental axiom that's being presented here is like an ideal mimicry, right? That and not in some cheap way, like do the best you can, find a good example, and just kind of do that. It's like, no, the only thing there is refinement of this notion of mimicry.
Yeah.
I teach movement to people, like strength training and other things like that, and I'm realizing that I commonly exaggerate this point where I'm like, don't underestimate mimicry. Like when you see someone doing something, and you and I can relate on this personally because of our attachment to skating, because one of the in a sort of like and class, bear with me here since this is like our stuff, but I think it connects with what we're talking about because it relates to a sort of primitive form of education, right? Like in a tradition like skating or something where you're doing tricks and seeing the way that other people do things. And it's not like a more pedagogical pursuit like baseball or playing the flute or something that has like rigid forms of this is how you scale across this discipline. It's I think the fundamental axiom that's being discussed here is how to drum something out of nothing. Yes. Because that's actually what the things that are in play are chaos and order with respect to consciousness, right?
You're going against the tide. Like I feel like but you're the thing going against the tide, trying to make one out of zero.
Yeah.
Right. And I wanted to say this to you before I forgot it. And I think this will make sense for the class. So tell me if this was your experience in skating, right? Before you could ever do a new trick, you had to, I don't want to say visualize. People use that word for this type of phenomenon, but I don't think it's quite right. It's not that you're seeing yourself doing it. You're feeling what it would feel like to do the trick properly. Usually by watching the way somebody else had done it beforehand. And I'm going to use I hate to do this, it's a very niche example. Class, sorry. Give me a minute. The way Sean Kelso revolutionized the front torque.
Sure.
Right? There's a way that you can feel that was different than people conceptualized before. And then once you knew what that felt like, it was much easier to do. Right?
Yes.
So there's an imitation of the spirit of the thing. What it's almost like to have that attitude, that tuning as you navigate through the world. That's hard to communicate. But I think,
It's actually really relevant to what we're talking about right now. And there's plenty of examples across physical pursuits,
yeah.
or like, uh, I can't remember that guy who just ran the 2 hour marathon,
Mhm.
but and many sorts of like physical progress pursuits
Yeah.
are at the behest of one person sort of sacrificing themselves for the potential of that barrier being broken.
Yeah.
And then within hours, minutes, days, 25, 100 other people do it.
Yep.
It's not always the case, but it's commonly the case, which
Mhm.
is what's being discussed here, sort of the scale of one person sacrificing themselves for a potential, and then how that sort of division of labor is drawn upon.
So once that barrier is first broken through, other people are free to enter.
Mm,
I think Dostoevsky is saying that that's what the Christ figure originally did,
right.
was to show what it would be like, what it would feel like intuitively, instinctively, the type of things you would have to do to imitate in order to deal with a new stage of consciousness as a species. So that sounds insane for a second. I realize. Let me give you some context for what I mean. We've talked before about how when I had my daughter, the first thing that stood out to me was that she only had negative or no emotions for like a couple months, and then positive emotions started to come. Like it was either needs not being fulfilled, and so suffering and like screaming, like feed me, that sort of thing, or just like a void type state. But no, laughing comes later, and smiles come later, that sort of thing. And I feel like there's a metaphor there, or maybe the metaphor I'm going to use actually explains that phenomenon. For every time you break a barrier and learn something new, and the pain. So let me give you an example. I use this example with my class when we're reading a selection from Anna Karenina. Um, we talk about these stages of mastery because there's this character Levin who he's like a rich guy, landowner in Russia, for reasons I won't get into, is looking for something in his life, ends up farming, mowing the fields with his peasants, and notices a very older peasant who has mastered the craft. And so he does everything unconsciously. Whereas Levin, not knowing what he's doing and being thrown into it, has to think consciously about everything that he does, every little movement. But there are moments where everything flows, sort of a flow state argument, right? Um, and he strives for those sorts of moments so that he can be like the old man who has mastered it. And what we talked about in class were these stages of mastery that the mind sort of goes through, where the first stage is you're unconsciously incompetent. So you're so dumb in like a Dunning-Kruger effect type way, where you don't know what you don't know. So you're blissfully ignorant, sort of an Edenic state. Then you fall. You realize that you're incompetent, but you're conscious of it now, which might be maybe Ivan's stage, right? But talking about life on a grander scale. And then there's the third stage where you become consciously competent, where you're still thinking about everything. Like when you're learning to ride a bike, you have to think about every pedal and every every little movement to keep yourself balanced. Or driving a car, you have to think about how hard to put your foot on the gas and the brake and how much to turn to correct. Otherwise, you overcorrect and go off the road. So you have to calibrate yourself. But then eventually, when you ride a bike or drive a car or play an instrument or something like that, any endeavor, the goal, once again, at the end is this sort of unconscious competence where you're not thinking anymore and it's become integrated into your body once again. So the conscious mind, the part of you that's there to sort of course correct for things that the body can't fix or unconscious processes can't fix on their own or deal with on their own, um, can be turned off again. And we've talked about this a long time ago in like the Zen sense, like this, the no mind as the goal. Um, so what point am I trying to make here? Well, I think the fall is one of those, the eating of the apple is one of those falls into unconscious, from unconscious incompetence, blissful ignorance, into a consciousness, a painful consciousness that you don't know enough. And it seems like Dostoevsky is making the argument that the Christ figure is the aspiration that you should be attempting to imitate. And if you do so, you will be consciously competent in spurts, like when Alyosha kisses Ivan. But he's not quite there yet. But I think he has all of those different layers mapped out. Does this progression make sense to some extent? And then, what would I say? Let me bring this back to my AP students real quick. He talked about in The Great Gatsby how there was something admirable about Gatsby, even though there was something very corrupt and materialistic and terrible about it at the same time. And Nick, the narrator, said that it was this capacity for hope. And I think we all agreed that there was something about the green light that he was reaching for. Whether you want to think of it simplistically as just Daisy, or symbolic of the American dream, or of the, as we talked about, the sort of platonic form of Gatsby that he had conceptualized when he was a teenager. But it was an ideal that he was constantly reaching for. But it was, perhaps he got the mechanism right, but the goal was wrong. And his goal, he reached it. He got Daisy. And then he didn't know what to do, so he floundered. He lost her and his ideal and everything all at once. And we went into The Stranger. And we tried to figure out how, in a universe where we are designed to want answers to the questions we can't have, and we're in a Sisyphean situation where we're constantly, by instinct, driven to ask why, and to push the boulder up to the top of the hill, only to have it fall down because we can't ever know why, to the types of questions Ivan's talking about in The Grand Inquisitor. Why did Camus say that one must imagine Sisyphus happy? Well,
Sisyphus happy, did you say?
yes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And he was a huge fan of Dostoevsky. I think Dostoevsky's argument is that your green light, your ideal, needs to be something you can never reach, because we need to always be pursuing something. And so what you want to do is aim to be the person who aims at the goal of perfection that he will never reach. And Dostoevsky is presenting that in the form of Alyosha, which is why in every kid's yearbook, and the reason that I sort of wanted to bring this up is because I won't get to write your yearbooks this year. This is what I would have written. They're all allusions to books we've read, Ben, so this might make some sense to you, it might not. To avoid being a pipe for fortune's finger. That's from Hamlet. Choose a worthy green light, whatever that might be. I don't write that part. Choose a worthy green light. Cultivate your garden. And whenever life gives you an opportunity to shoot or not shoot, this is from The Stranger. Merceau realized in any given scenario, you're presented with the situation, and like when he got handed a gun, he could either shoot or not shoot. You could choose the options available to you. So choose a worthy green light. Choose an ideal that's worth your time and that you will never ever reach, but that's a good thing. Choose a worthy green light. Cultivate your garden. And whenever life hands you a gun and gives you an opportunity to shoot or not shoot, choose to kiss the Inquisitor. And that's essentially my thesis for the course. But also, I would say, perhaps to some extent, Dostoevsky's thesis for elements of his work. Now, he's a much deeper thinker than I am. And then maybe if you do that, if every time you can shoot or not shoot, you choose to kiss the Inquisitor, maybe that becomes a habit because we are what we pretend to be. The way Gatsby became what he pretended to be, and the way Hamlet, in pretending to be crazy, became crazy in another way. Pretend to be the best thing you could possibly conceive of, and then practice it. And you'll never get there, but it's better than not doing it. And that's why Alyosha's right. And Ivan is correct, but wrong. So that's my piece on that. Benjamin, I'll throw it over to you. Sorry for monopolizing the time again.
No, that was, I feel fortunate for getting to watch that. It occurs to me, and having not read more than this passage, I'm interested in the connections to both, as I've alluded to already, sort of like his criticism of New Age thinking. Like I really thought about, as we were discussing this, how there was a potential to cycle back to like even in the idea of pursuing an ideal, it's kind of like like this sort of follow your bliss thing. He attempts to shut this down in his like anti-Euclidean, it is what it is kind of argument. He's like, I just adored him going, no, I need in my lifetime to see this explained or forgiven. Anyway, I bring this all up to say, like, this is a self-help text in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think his ideal is spoken in his how tight his trap is, of his thinking trap, and that this being the ideal to seek, because the counterpoint is so many contemporary self-help thinking and sort of even like type things that have replaced religious thought are all about low resolution truths, like all you have to do is eat kale for 30 days and then you'll be happy. All you have to do is this simple thing and that'll justify the suffering. And what he's kind of contending here is that there's a justification for producing a wide lateral dichotomy, and that's as close as to right or to true as you can get, and it still like kneels at the altar of kissing the Inquisitor, right? It still falls incrementally short of that.
Yeah.
And I see that as a beautiful challenge, really, to produce this landscape of a wider and wider Inquisition and fill it in with pursuits, with heights, with peaks, with different approaches, and still feel content to lay it down when it's time.
Oof. Well, that was beautiful, sir. And on that note, I do believe I'm out of time. So I would just like to thank you for doing this. I hope the class gets something out of this. I know I did. And I hope we can do this again soon. So I'm going to sign out of this real quick. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, guys.
Do well on your AP test. Goodbye.